Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here with all of you virtually today and introducing you to this qualitative analysis tool. Feel free to ask questions as we go. We've got a couple hours here together. I'm going to start with some slides of just sort of setting the stage and making sure we're on the same page of what we're expecting from a piece of qualitative analysis software like NVivo before moving into some walkthroughs with the software. And so if you have a trial for the tool or a license and want to follow along eventually, I'll be showing some downloads for some common data that we can share and work with together, or anything that you might have on your computer, or I'll be sharing my screen and talking through each thing as we go as well. So to further set that stage here, NVivo is an example of a qualitative analysis tool, and I like to think about this as sort of a workbench or a desktop or a desk or what have you, a place in which you do the work of looking at qualitative, interview transcripts, long form survey results, focus group conversations, those kind of things, and working with them in the way you would outside of the software, but all in one place that we can leverage the fact that we're using a computer program to manage and organize things in one spot. So it's going to be a tool that organizes and manages our data. The primary task that anyone does while working in a piece of software like NVivo is called coding, which is selecting text, tagging, and marking that with a concept or an idea or a thought that you're wanting to follow along. And then once that primary job is done, the software allows us to query, search, analyze all of the material in a rapid fashion to find commonalities and patterns in our data. Once we eventually get to screen sharing, I just want to remind you that you are able to, take my face and the other faces perhaps off the screen. If you go to your view options, you don't really necessarily need to see us, so that you can sort of side by side the screen share and the software if you are trying to follow along, just so that you're not overly distracted by our lovely faces. And I did want to start by highlighting that NVivo is one of many options in the qualitative analysis software space, where it is a set of software tools that unfortunately at the moment you kind of are forced in the commercial have to pay for it licensed side of things, because the free and open source options just aren't there. There is no, if you've done statistical analysis for a long time, people were on, and people still are using SPSS or Stata or expensive license products that the university is covering, but then R and some of these open source tools have kind of taken the stage and taken things by storm. There isn't that same thing yet in qualitative space. The licensed tools do really still rule the day. And so NVivo is by far the most popular tool used at the University of Minnesota, and from my experience, largely broadly in the social and behavioral sciences. It's followed pretty closely by its chief competitor, Atlas TI. And you might also, as you're talking, hear people talk about Deduce, which is an all online cloud tool that approximates some of the things that the desktop licenses do. If ever you find yourself without a license to NVivo when you're wanting to continue in this space, on the free and open source side, what I would recommend you look into is the tool called QualCoder. That tool is able to import the open source archival versions of projects that NVivo will produce that we'll talk about. And so it is a little bit interoperable in that way. And it seems to be the most fully featured at this moment. With those words of start out of the way, a couple things I wanted to frame as far as our conversation. I am going to be talking about certain types of analyses using NVivo and thinking qualitatively, but people use this tool in a very wide variety of places. And so you can think about very unmotivated, our grounded theory building, where you don't really know what you're looking for and you're being very exploratory, or you could have a very rigid set of expectations of how you're trying to analyze your data, and everything in between in the realm of qualitative analysis and people are using this type of software. So it's pretty agnostic to those considerations. But the thing I need to highlight, especially in this world of generative AI, is that NVivo will not do your analysis for you. It does not yet have AI enhancements into it that attempts to do proper analysis or coding and to tell you what your data say. It is a place in which you do that work. And so in the same way, a word processor, Google Docs, Word, what have you, are a place where you do writing, and NVivo is a place where you do close reading and analysis. And so today we will be looking sort of for the full range of what this tool can offer. We're going to start by walking through how we can manage materials that we have gathered, whether those, again, are transcripts, audio, video recordings, images, PDFs, policy documents, newspaper articles. People do, very detailed lit reviews in this tool. So maybe you're pulling in things from citation managers. So we'll talk about how you bring all that kind of stuff in. And then once it's in and managed in the tool, we'll walk through how we can code or tag or mark up those documents, also touching a bit on transcribing audio features. Once we've got some things coded, we'll walk through some of the later stages of analysis and talk about how you make inferences based on the analysis you've done in the coding you've done on your documents, and then point a little bit to how you can bring things in from other data collection tools or data organization tools and get stuff back out of this proprietary licensed software when you're finished with it. There should be plenty of time for questions and answers. There are definitely going to be myriad buttons that we don't directly talk about, and if you're curious about those features, feel free to ask, and we'll see what time we have to make sure we're talking about as much of that as we can. The last thing I want to point at before we actually get into the software is sort of ground ourselves in at least how I think about doing qualitative data analysis. And I'm obviously borrowing this from Doug Ducharme, who is sort of as meta as one gets in qualitative analysis. He's a qualitative scholar who studies how other qualitative scholars do their work. And of course, he does that in a qualitative fashion. But he came up with this sort of funneling approach, or winnowing approach, as he calls it, that I really appreciate in thinking about how we start with a lot of information when we do any type of qualitative research, and some of it isn't directly going to be relevant. And so we immediately start to winnow that down or shed some of the less important pieces of information down to just what's relevant. And then the best way, or the word that we typically use for sorting that relevant information into discrete, understandable units that we can label in some way, is identifying codes or concepts into that information. Once we have those, we tend to aggregate back up in some sort of way of trying to find how those concepts, those codes, hang together into broader categories that hopefully tell some sort of thematic story. And those themes then answer the question that we started with. And the key part here is that in each section here, each stage of narrowing down into our research answer, we are, as researchers, making decisions that are not necessarily visible to anybody that are not in our brain. And one of the benefits that quantitative scholars have is that usually the quantitative tool that they're using is tracking the analyses that they're doing, the recoding of variables, the various models that they're running in some sort of way, right? Using a tool like NVivo helps us approximate that, in that it can allow us to take notes and make more plain the decisions that we're making as we go through the analysis process. Who did what, when, if we're working on a team, or continuously prompting us to have a comment or a description to different parts of our work, to hopefully make those decisions a little bit more transparent. So when we write things up, it is clearer how we went from the starting of our material to the claims and inferences that we're making at the end. NVivo projects have lots of different components. It eventually will create a single file that you're able to share or back up on a cloud storage service. and that will contain all of these different parts in it. And so when we import our files, they become part of that project unless they are very large video files, which people tend not to import, but those will get sort of pointed to by the software. Everything else will become part of your main project file. And then the other thing that you may see if you look things up about NVivo or you find older training videos is what used to be called nodes in their way of throwing N at the beginning of many different things, and now are just called codes, or that idea of capturing concepts and ideas. We're also going to talk a bit about cases, which are the way of either putting together lots of different documents into one observational unit. Maybe if you're comparing different organizations, different sites, different groups together, and you want to have those broad comparisons with all the different pieces from those groups, you can create a case that would encapsulate those things. Or conversely, if you're looking at many different individuals that you're trying to study, what a case allows you to do is have what's called a classification and attributes about that. So essentially demographic information about your participants that you can then later use to slice and dice the data. So we'll talk a bit about classifications, which is the way to hold lots of little pieces of information that you might be importing into your project, and then cases as a way of organizing and setting up your comparisons between those concepts that we're going to call codes. If you would like to you work on the same set of sample materials that I am, the link on your screen, and that's now showing up in the chat, will allow you to download a zipped folder full of the sample materials that I'm about to use. It's pretty simple Word documents, PDF documents, and perhaps an audio file that we'll be talking about today, at least to get started. Eventually, we'll be moving on to the fully formed sample project that NVivo automatically provides for us, but I wanted to use some of these isolated pieces of information to demonstrate how we will import things into NVivo. Again, this link would take you to a Google Drive folder. You would download, and in that there's a zipped folder so everything comes down as one. And once you've downloaded that, if you're on a Mac, I think it will kindly unzip that for you all. Otherwise, you'll need to extract that in Windows to open up all the different little pieces of information that are in there. All right. Are there any sort of scene setting questions that I can answer before I switch my screen sharing and move into the tool? Right. Not seeing any, I am going to switch here over to the opening screen of NVivo. And here would be a good part to note that I am working on a Windows computer. And so this is what the opening screen looks like in Windows. All the features that we're going to talk about today are present as well in the Mac version of the software, and 99% of the buttons and things will look the same. That means that there's 1% or so of the screens and buttons that will look slightly different, and flag to me if I need to be more explicit about those differences and you're not finding things when those differences do arise. The two versions between Mac and Windows are largely equivalent at this point. It's sort of more of the high-powered compute features that we're not really going to even touch on today that are different between the two tools mainly now. And for some reason, the starting screen. And so what I'm going to do here on the starting screen is open a new project for today's session. And I am just going to call this the workshop on March 21. You'll see that at least in my version, it is letting me know where that is going to be saved. For some reason, it's pointing to my downloads folder. I don't exactly know why it's choosing to do that at the moment. Maybe the last NVivo project I opened was from my downloads folder. I don't care at the moment, but otherwise I would probably browse and put it in a more logical place. You're seeing how it's going to prompt you to describe many of the different things. If this is a project with a specific purpose, you can add that description there. When I click next on the Windows version, I'm going to get some options about how I want my saving to go. There are other places to reach these choices on the Mac version. The main decision for Mac is whether you're going to auto save or not. I don't have NVivo save my projects immediately because it takes away my ability to undo things. And particularly for when I'm teaching, it's important to be able to bounce back and forth. But if you're not a person that tends to use the undo button and you don't want to have to worry about saving, you can turn on that auto save feature. I do let it nag me. So if I'm in a longer, work session, that I do get reminded to press the save button. The Mac version is automatically creating backups, I think, pretty much all the time. So there isn't any decisions to be made. In the Windows version, you can choose how frequently you want it to make a shadow backup version just in case something happens. The software is exponentially more stable than it was, say, 5 years ago. But sometimes these project recovery files are still needed. And so I have it help me as frequently as I can. And typically on a larger project, I have it rotating at least 2 different backup copies of that project. I don't necessarily need that here, but that's the idea. And then it shows you where those are going to be saved. And again, if you need it in a certain place on your machine that is more secure than others, you could identify that place in that spot. And so I'm just going to now hit create project. That's going to think for a moment. All right, and it suggests that maybe we could do a tour. I am going to skip the tour at the moment, and here we are into the NVivo software. So now that we are here, let's just get a little bit oriented to what we're looking at. It should look familiar as to other sort of standard operating procedures for what Office-based tools look like now, where we have navigation down our left-hand side and buttons across the top of our screen. You can see things are sort of nicely organized here, where we've got the place where it shows where we're importing data into our project. Then we're going to organize our thoughts about our project in that second section. And finally, where we're going to do some more exploration into our materials at the bottom. And so we'll be moving through these different components as we go. But for the time being, I am going to go to the Import tab at the top of the screen, and I am going to ask to import some files. And here we've got the browse screen opening, and I can navigate to my downloads, where I will attempt to outsmart my new Windows that I'm still trying to get used to about how it organizes things. And one of these folders will be the NVivo sample folder that we downloaded from that Z-link I provided if you're using the common set of data. What I'm going to import at the moment is a Word document. So if you didn't download that set of documents, any Word document will do. I am going to choose this document that's called Charles, as well as Barbara, and I'm just holding down the Control Command key to multiple select. You cannot import an entire folder at a time, but once you're in a folder, you can select as many files as you would like at a given moment. So I'm going to choose those 2 Word documents. It's going to double check that I'm really serious about that, and I'm going to press import. We'll wait a moment, and there it will show me. Now I'm in my files section of my project here, and I have a Barbara and Charles file with a little icon here that should look vaguely like a piece of paper with some scribbles on it, which demonstrates it is a normal text document. And so plain.txt or rich text files or Word documents, those types of files are all going to end up looking like that. And when I double click on Barbara, I will open that up here in NVivo. and you'll see that it maintains most all of the formatting that we would have seen would we had to have opened this document up in Word directly. And so there's, different colors to text. Some things are bolded or italicized in a heading font versus a normal font. All those types of things is coming through just fine. And because it's a Word document, it kind of takes up as much space as it can. And if I, start to adjust that, I can move my view around a little bit. A thing to note, as I brought this in, obviously Barbara and Charles lived in a certain place on my computer. And if you are a person who does a lot of organization with the names of folders that you create, once you bring things into NVivo, all that beautiful organization does disappear. And that sort of promotes strong file naming practices, not calling everything transcript or interview or something else that's generic and doesn't directly identify it. And so here, using the identifier I've chosen for these participants is one way to do that. Some people also get in the practice of having many words in their file names so that their file names are a little bit longer to identify that this is an interview transcript for participant so-and-so, right? You can sort of come up with your own schema for that, but if any of that organizational material is in your folder structure, you're not going to see that when you bring things here into NVivo. But here we have Barbara and Charles. And if I wanted to create a folder structure here, I would be able to do that. I could go to the Create button at the top, and on the far right-hand side, I do have the option to create a folder if I want to isolate some documents. And I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to call this one Countries, if I can type correctly, Countries, because I'm about to bring in some documents that have to do with countries. And so you'll notice that underneath Files, a little caret has appeared, and the word Countries, which is a folder that can contain other documents. And you can call those whatever you'd like. I could have also two-finger clicked over here on Files and chosen New Folder and created it in that way if I didn't want to go through clicking on the ribbon and finding the folder button. So we see a document there. I'm going to go back to Import and go back to Files, and it's going to remember where I was on my machine the last time I imported things into this project, and so it's trying to open that NVivo samples folder. And here you can see I've got a couple of different PDFs, one Australia, one Canada, and I'm going to select two at a time again here and press Open. It's going to ask if I'm sure I want to import those things, and yes, I am. And there we go. You may notice that they showed up next to the other files. I did that intentionally to indicate we do need to be very careful at all points in this tool about where we have our sort of navigation listed window here pointed, because the buttons and tasks we do are going to be very context dependent on that. And so I did not ever navigate into this countries folder. And so when I imported those two documents that had country names that maybe I wanted to go there, they did not go there because I was still in my main folder. NVivo did not know that. But the other thing we can now do is select those two documents, or one at a time, whatever we'd like. We got two with my Control or Command button to have both selected, and then with both selected, I can drag and drop them over to countries, and now they're existing where I maybe originally intended them to go. I'm now going to open the Australia PDF. You can see that it is showing us a different little icon there with the Adobe triangle thing that indicates it's a PDF file. And if I open that up, we'll see that that does look different in NVivo. And so here we have, you can see that there's a clear boundary for the page, for instance, and then it is directly reproducing that document as it was displayed as a PDF file. Couple other things to note about differences between using a PDF or another text file. One thing you might notice in the text file, I have this ability to edit the document. And so if I check this button for edit, I would be able to make changes. I could delete that whole paragraph if I so chose, but I can also do more useful things like add heading styles, which can be used to break documents up automatically, or edit small different errors that may have been in the document. The big note here is that if you are collaborating, and we'll talk more about collaboration later on, if one of you edits a document, it is no longer the same as your collaborator's document. They are now technically two separate files. And so typically when we're talking about collaboration, we do pretend like this button does not exist. But if you're working by yourself, feel free to edit away. In a PDF, we don't have that same option. There is no ability to edit the PDFs. The other thing to note about a PDF is that if you're able to select the text when you're just opening that document and the text is recognized, that text will be recognized and selectable in NVivo as well. If conversely, when you open a PDF, it looks more like an image and you can't directly drag and select the text, that will also be true in NVivo. It does not have any character recognition capabilities. It can't figure that out for you. If you need that to happen, you'll need to run that character recognition in Adobe or some other tool before you bring the documents into NVivo. Otherwise, your options here, and you can kind of see it on my ribbon, is that I could select by region, right? And so if I had an image-based document or something, I could choose what area of the document I want to mark up rather than selecting specifically by text. And I can also switch between those selection modes at any time by two-finger clicking or right-clicking in the document and adjusting the selection mode. When I'm in a Word document, I am locked into, selecting the text that is present. Okay, before we start directly working on these things, let's import a couple more documents just to see what those are going to appear like and make sure that they are getting organized into the correct places in our project. I guess before we do that, I'll note that you can have multiple things open here and we get tabs just like you would have maybe in an internet browser. And so you can tab between the different documents here in NVivo. I'm going to navigate myself back up to the files top level to get out of that, to get out of the countries folder, and then I will import. And here, as it thinks for a moment, I'm going to import an audio file. And so here you can see I have a phone interview with Rhonda, which is an MP3 file, and I will import that just to see what that ends up looking like. And so when we import a single document rather than multiple documents at a time, we tend, at least in the Windows version, to get some questions if we want to add descriptions or notes about that document, and if we want to switch over and add some additional information. At this stage, I very, very rarely do anything other than just click the OK button, which is why frequently I import multiple documents at one time, so I skip that step entirely. So now with this audio file, we can see that it's got the little audio logo. And if I were to open that interview up, we're going to see that we get a waveform timeline of how, loud or soft the different components of the interview are, and an area where if we were to import an auto-generated transcript, it would go, or we could begin the transcription process inside the software, and it would keep that transcription here. And we'll talk more about that here in a moment. What is it complaint? I see in the chat that there is some difficulties with the MP3 file. What are the messages that you're getting?
I'm pulling it up again, but it is showing a log, an NVivo log, with like the
Yep.
audio file text in red, just showing
Okay.
an error.
Are you on a Mac?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. There, and I don't have a clear answer for this, and I will explore again. I sometimes with some people on some Macs, audio and video files work flawlessly, and sometimes video files cause the errors that you're seeing, and sometimes audio files do as well. And I have not gotten a satisfactory answer from the support folks about why that is. There are on their support pages, there are some what they call codecs, which are decoding little pieces of software that help understand audio and video files for the software. They should be built into the Mac, so I think it's more of a thing of when it got installed, somehow it didn't figure out that that stuff was there, and you're just reminding it. I don't know enough to say why and why that happens for some people and not for others. And I'm sorry you're seeing that error.
No problem. I'll just follow along. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got these documents in. We've organized a couple things into a folder structure. We can nest folders as deeply as we'd like. Nested, I'm just writing to demonstrate that we could have a folder inside a folder if we so chose. The other note I want to say about organization here is that a file lives in a single folder, just like it would on your, your computer or something like that. But there are ways to organize things in more sort of overlapping multiple memberships. And that, if you look under this organization place on the left-hand side of your screen, is what NVivo calls a set. And so I use sets for a couple different ways of organizing my material. And for instance, I'm going to select these two transcripts for the time being and two-finger click to bring this view up. I could create it another way, but I find this the most straightforward. And I'm going to say I want to create this as a static set. And I wouldn't worry too much about that static word. I don't love it, and it's a recent addition to the software. I still just call them sets. I'm going to call this my to read list, just to demonstrate one way I tend to use sets. And so that has added those two documents to that set. You notice that they don't move, they don't go anywhere. I could also add, if I go to Canada, I could say add to static set here and choose my to read list and say okay. And so I can have documents from different, sorry, my light, different folders going into the same set. I can have codes and concepts also being to that set. And so it's sort of a loosey-goosey way of organizing and creating a list that I might want to use. So when I click on sets and I open up my list of sets here and my to read list, you can see there's Barbara, Charles, and Canada, all the different documents I added to this group. And there are little arrows to the document demonstrating that it's just a shortcut. It is not the document itself. If I were to double click on Charles, I'm going to see it. It's not like it's not there, but the fact that it's a shortcut means were I to delete Charles from this, I'm just deleting the shortcut. I'm not actually getting rid of the file from my project. I'm just removing it from this list. And so I use this to keep a to-do list. I use this to sometimes keep these things are most interesting to me, and I can add things to it as I come to them. There's my save reminder. And so I tend to keep a couple different sort of just project organization sets going. I know some people who also use them in later stages of their analysis to organize groupings of concepts or codes into sort of those categories or themes that they think are hanging together. And the set also provides them that flexibility of those codes don't need to all be in the same folder or hierarchy or whatnot to be thought of as one unit. And if you change your mind and want to remove one, again, it's as easy as clicking on the option and deleting it from the list, and you haven't destroyed anything else anywhere in your project. And so I find that sort of loose organization structure sometimes more useful even than coming up with folders. The folders I sort of more think of as ways to hide things away that if I don't want to look at them and I don't want to have a super, super long list. But I use sets more as actual sort of, I want to think about these things together. Are there any questions about organizing your materials or importing materials at this stage before we start actually working with them? Yeah, and I can speak briefly to dynamic sets. One of the differences is that dynamic sets I don't believe exist in the Mac version yet. The other thing is a dynamic set is created based on a query or a search. And in all honesty, I have not found a reason to use them yet. But the idea was that you would add documents or codes as they started to match some sort of search or query that you had set up. And so it would be dynamically creating this grouping. I haven't had a reason to use it. I have had a reason to use a set that I set up myself, which they now call static sets. All right, I see a couple questions here. Recommending using sets to assign different coders to different documents. That is definitely one way that you could do that for sure. You could have different coders set for each coder, and they could complete the tasks, and you could even have them, remove a document from their set as they finished coding it to say that they had finished, or move it from their to-do. Maybe you'd have two sets for that coder, their to-do list and then their finished list, so you wouldn't lose that metadata on who was doing what. It does track if you don't, I'm trying to see if it is in this list here. So I have adjusted my workspace, and we'll talk briefly about adjusting my workspace. But in a standard workspace in this list here, you would have the information of who imported and modified or created this document and when they did that. And I've just adjusted it at one point, and I forgot to add it back before our workshop. And so I'll do that here in a second. I saw another question on from Fang about how functions benefit our analysis process. And I am curious about what function you are referring to.
Yeah, for myself, I just open the file and then code it directly. So
Yeah.
long I don't use these functions like get a static sets.
Sure.
So I think maybe it's easier for us. Yeah, so I'm just
Yeah.
talking about how I can use this function to better do the data analysis.
Understood. Thank you for restating that. I appreciate it. So there are two ways that I see static sets useful for analysis. One is simply on project management and organization. So if you're doing a big project or you're a person who loses track of where they are in things, I like to have these are the things I was intending to do next kind of set that keeps those ideas organized for me. Or if I'm going many days between looking at a project, putting a set together that has these are the concepts that were most interesting, or the interviews that were most interesting, or the things I was curious about exploring more, and just using it to organize myself in remembering some of those things. So that's one way I find it helpful for analysis. The second is on the later stage of the actual analysis and meaning making that you're trying to do on your materials. And so sometimes projects just require coming up with concepts or codes, tagging those codes on documents, and then describing those codes. And that's sort of what research question requires for a given project. In other cases, you're looking for those relationships between concepts, you're trying to find patterns, or broader themes that are beyond maybe describing what's happening. And again, that's just sort of a different research question. And then I sometimes find sets useful to organize and cluster and remember how different concepts or different codes go together conceptually in my mind and in my framework, rather than creating a mind map, rather than reorganizing my code book to match that. I use sets so that I can keep my code book the way it was when I was doing the original coding. So those are the two main ways that I use a set to help my analysis, either at the end, sort of looking at codes, or throughout the project as an organizational tool. And that is to say, not everybody uses them, and on a number of projects, I don't use them at all, right? And so it's not a requisite by any means. Okay. So those are the main ways that one can organize your materials as you bring things in. I did not talk about all the different types of things one can import. Obviously, there's the potential of bringing in direct video, which would look like this audio file, except with a picture that moves, in this blank space above that timeline. We could bring in an individual image. I don't think that would have any difficulties for people, and so I'm just going to grab this JPEG just to show what that looks like. And there is that image for Canada protest, just to see what that, it's just going to be a picture there, right? And so those are some different types of files we can bring in. You can also import full survey data, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. There's sort of a wizard of how to work through that, and you can decide whether you want to use closed-ended questions to sort of sort your materials, or ignore them completely and just work with the open-ended responses that you want to analyze qualitatively. Sometimes you can directly log into your university Qualtrics account, and it can directly pull those responses in. Very, very frequently, either Qualtrics changes something or NVivo changes something, and they don't talk to each other, and so that function breaks. And so then you need to download your Qualtrics data and import it as an Excel sheet or as a CSV. You can import exported material from your citation manager if you're trying to do a systematic review or some large-scale, lit review. That works well as well. And then the other thing I do want to point out is that if you are doing sort of field work or note-taking and you're using a digital notebook like Evernote or OneNote, you can directly log into either of those accounts and pull in that material directly and have those notebook pages show up as a document like this. All right, moving on from importing and managing material, I think we have spent plenty of time on that. Let's start talking about how we would actually work with these documents in our project. And as we're looking at this transcript, we could imagine that we find a paragraph that is interesting to us and has some meaning that we want to mark for our study. And so it's quite as simply as selecting that paragraph. I tend to just two-finger click and say code selection. On Mac, this entry is called quick code selection, and it will bring up a largely similar view. We have no concepts yet in our code book, and so I'm going to first need to say create a new top-level code. I'm going to be uncreative here and call this concept 1, but you would give it a proper conceptual name if you were to be doing this in analysis. And then I would click on code selection. You'll note that it gave me a little green arrow right next to the word code that said it coded something, but I have by default no indication that anything changed on my document. I dislike this strongly, and I want to be able to see that I'm doing something. And there are two ways to do that. One, if you're a person who sort of works from the top to the bottom of an interview as you're reading it and making sense of it, One of the easiest ways is to just check and track your progress as you're doing that and moving from one transcript or one document or whatever you're looking at to the next, is to turn on highlighting. And so there's this little pen-like icon above my document. And if I click on it, I can ask for highlighting for all coding. And that's simply going to turn things yellow as I move down the document and apply codes. And sometimes if I'm just looking for progress and places that I've found information, that's all I need it to do. More frequently, I'm going to turn that highlighting off, I use these 3 vertical stripes here, which are called the coding stripes, so that it tracks exactly what concepts I've identified where in a document and shows that to me. And so I'm going to click on the coding stripe and choose, I want to see all codes. Once you get many concepts, there ends up being a lot of stripes. And so you might only choose selected concepts you want to look at, or those that are most or least frequent in your document, or the things you've been doing most recently. But right now I'm going to just choose all. Because we only have one code, it's not going to be that big of a deal. And so you'll see a new section of my screen has just appeared with the stripes showing up and a little pink line here for concept 1. Most likely, if this is your first time using the software, your stripe is actually empty. It's clear. It has no coloration to it. And so you'll want to go back to the coding stripes button and then go down to this select colors option. And it by default will say item colors. I usually set it to automatic colors. Now, if you're a person who likes to color code things and you want to choose the color of your highlights and those types of things, leave it at item colors, and we'll talk about how to set the color for each code momentarily. I am not a person who uses color to help organize things, and so I let it choose colors for me, just so that there's some distinction between the different concepts. And you'll see that if I select maybe the next thing that Barbara said, and I am going to code this selection, I'm going to create a new concept again here, imagining that I'm doing this sort of inductively as we go on. And I can see her talking. I'm just going to say community because I see the word community and I'm not thinking too deeply about this right now. And so we're going to have 2 different concepts now showing up. And you'll see that that stripe shows up immediately since I'm asking for all codes to come up. When I hover my mouse over, the other thing you should see is that in parens, I have my initials. And so when you started the software the first time, you should have given your name and the initials you want to be known by. And that is tracking who did what and when, and so that it will show who applied that concept. And if you're working on a team, there are going to be easier ways to do some checking of what your collaborators have done, but I wanted to point out that that is at least present there as well. And so I've got 2 different concepts now applied to this document, one called community, one with just a generic letter. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more and select again, and again go to that code selection or quick code, but this time I'm going to choose both of my concepts using the control key or the command key to select multiple concepts to demonstrate that you can apply as much meaning to a given selection as you would like, and it will track that and show that both concepts were identified for this section of text. The other thing that you can do is you can select as little or as much as you'd like, and so here I have not selected the entirety of certain words, and it's sort of just a random phrase. I am going to go again to code selection and just give me another concept and mistype that, and that's fine. And now, again, we can have things of different lengths showing up in our coding here. And so that is applying some codes to this particular Word document. If I were to switch over to, again, just clicking on the tab to move over to a PDF, I can do very similarly, where I select some text, I go to code selection, I choose a code, probably doesn't apply, but that's fine, and apply it that way. If I want to select to region coding, just to demonstrate what that would look like, I could do this selection, and I'm going to code this one to concept 1 for our example. I'm going to move to this audio file. If I were to transcribe, again, we'll get to that in a moment, but the other thing I could do is just select on the timeline, and it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but I just selected from about 40 seconds to maybe around a minute 10. And so that has been selected, and I could, oops, it's prompting me to save, sure. I'm just going to choose one of my recent codes and call that concept 1. And now it has applied a code there. And if I turn on my coding stripes for this document, I get this whole section that shows along the timeline where I'm identifying different concepts. And so it is possible, if you don't need a verbatim transcription, to use the timeline to transcribe an audio or video file instead of transcribing the written word of what showed up in that file. Sort of depends on your workflow and what you need from your analysis. If you just need presence and absence of different ideas across different interviews, then you don't necessarily need the verbatim transcript or how they talked about it, right? That is sometimes people's workflow. And so just selecting on the actual timeline would get you there. And then lastly, for an image, it's going to work like that area selection of the PDF where you can just drag them and create a box. And I'm going to code that, again, just to use a concept that already exists. So that's applying some different codes and creating them sort of on the fly. There are multiple ways to apply codes, however. And so if I wanted, I could, again, it always starts by selecting what you want to code. But I do have, if I excuse the Zoom documents here, there is a big button here at the top that says code once I have documents selected, and I could choose to click on code and code selection, and it will bring that same view up. There is also this button that's called code panel. If I want to see many things on my screen, I could choose to have a code panel where I could drag and drop my text onto the codes that I am interested in applying it to, and just to have that list of codes constantly present. The way that I tend to work, rather than turning on that code panel, which is a fairly new feature, and so when I got used to using NVivo, it did not exist, is I note that when I'm looking at this screen, I'm working on a very small portion of it. And I tend to want to get my workspace a little bit more efficient than that. And so I don't need to see the documents that I am not currently working on while I'm working on coding a document. And so one way I can do that is click on the code list so I can actually see my list of concepts. And now this is very well set up for doing that drag and dropping that code panel also allows for. And I could drop into this new area and it will prompt me to create a new concept, which is fairly handy. And this does it in the way that the Mac version always does it, where it prompts you to define the concepts, which I find very useful. And so here, I don't know, she's talking about environmental standards are words that I saw on that. And I could give a conceptual definition in which I write a few sentences about what this concept means and represents, right? And so you could provide that right away. And when you create new codes in the Mac version, it is going to show that sort of on the lower left-hand side of your screen immediately. And we'll say, okay. And so that new code will show up with that definition in place. In this code list, another thing that you'll notice, and a reason that it's sometimes useful to have open while I'm working, is that it's tracking how many different documents or files I have found this concept in across my project, and under references exactly how many times this concept has showed up across my project. So far, we're using a software to do things that one could do kind of anywhere, right? You can highlight documents in a word processor. You could color code that and change the color of your highlighter if you so chose. You could do those types of tasks and keep a list of what those concepts mean elsewhere. Where the power comes is the fact that if I want to see from 3 different documents I want to see the 4 times that the idea of community has emerged. All I need do is double click on the word community in my code list, wait a second for it to think, and it is being particularly slow given that it's running Zoom and screen sharing and this, so hopefully your machines are running a bit faster than mine, maybe not. You will get the tab that it's collated all 4 examples across all 3 documents, regardless of the type of document, of my identification of this idea of community. And so here we can see in the Barbara file, there are 2 references that have been coded, reference 1 and reference 2, the exact text that were found there. In the image Canada protest, this is the area in pixels of that image that were found. If I were on Mac, it would actually show me that section directly. I'll show you how to get to it here on Windows. And then in that Australia PDF, this is the section that I selected to show that as well. And so I get a quick list of all of them. And if I need to start writing my manuscript and starting to talk about what this concept means to people and how it's been represented in my data, I've now pulled across everything in my project, what this concept looks like, and I can start characterizing it. The other benefit is that even though I'm in a code, and this little circle icon here represents a code in NVivo, even though I'm in a code, I can treat this as if it were a new source material document. And that means I can see the coding stripes of other things that were also coded to this same concept in the document. And you can see that, for instance, this one also represents whatever concept 1 is. If I had a meaningful idea, it would be represented there. And I could see there's some interplay between those 2 ideas in what my participants are experiencing. Furthermore, if I want to select something and go to quick code and say this is also representing environmental standards, or whatever it's actually representing, I can do that here. And if I go back to Barbara, and I'm switching back to my Barbara transcript here, and I find that section back, thinking a lot, find that section back, I think it's higher, there we go. That was previously just coded as community, and now I've identified that it's also dealing with environmental standards. And so that ties back to the original part of the data. Everything is interoperable. And so this sets up nice patterns of cyclical analysis, which I think are very common in qualitative work, where you might identify a broad concept and then realize that there are, nuances there, or that you've missed something else as you've identified it and you want to go back and add new things. The other way that this becomes very useful is that you don't necessarily need to just use these codes as concepts or ideas that you're identifying in your project. You can also use them as organizational tools for different sections of your project. And in the way I mean that in to say, I often have a code that represents a very specific interview question that I asked across all my interviews. And so I can quickly gather everybody's response to their family history question and look at all the responses to family history and code them together rather than jumping from one long interview to the next long interview. I can keep a common conceptual frame about how I'm making sense of how people talk about their familial history. And that's a different style, right? And some people maybe want to keep their self grounded on a given participant at a given time, and then you don't do that, right? And that's part of the myriad ways that one can engage in qualitative analysis. But the fact that you can create these codes that sometimes might be structural or organizational and then work on them as if they were documents opens up that process, and it opens up the ability to continue to refine and deepen your understanding of any given idea. The other thing I want to note here on code organization is that you don't need to do it in this sort of inducted, grounded way. And I see that there are a couple questions, and I will get to those in just one moment. But rather than doing things inductive and groundedly, you could set up your code book at the start. And so the way one would do that would be to come here to the create button across the top and choose to create a code. Or if you wanted, you could, again, right or two-finger click in this code space and ask for a new code. And so here I might create a code that emotion, the respondent demonstrates strong emotion. And you'll notice my Achilles heel of typing well while doing teaching. And I'm sure I've got misspellings in there, but we're just going to move on for the time being. And I've got this new code, emotion. If I want, codes in NVivo are hierarchical, and I can treat this emotion code as a parent and provide it as many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren as I would like in a hierarchy of conceptualization. And so I'm going to select emotion first, and then I'm going to choose a new code, which is going to nest it under emotion. I'm going to demonstrate what I would do if I didn't do this as well. And so here I'm going to include happiness, and you would put a definition here if you're a good steward and say okay, and you'll see that it nests this idea of happiness underneath the concept of emotion. Right now I have nothing selected. If I go to create and create a code that's called anger, it's going to create that as a top level code. It didn't know I wanted to nest it under emotion because I did not have emotion selected. And so in this case, I would click on anger one time, then I would click and drag on the circle to drop it onto emotion. And NVivo can be a little finicky on your clicking and dragging. And so the thing I would recommend is click once, very much let go and wait a beat, then click and drag as you try to move something. And now I have anger and happiness both nested under emotion. I'm going to demonstrate one thing about this hierarchy before I peek at what people's queries are, but know that I am seeing them. I'm going to select this paragraph here, and I'm going to choose to code it to the concept of anger. And we're going to say, okay. All right. So it has been coded to anger. You can see in my code list, there's one file, one reference to the concept of anger. Nothing to the concept of emotion. And so that's something I do want to fix, because the benefit of creating this hierarchical nested structure is the fact that we can code at the lowest relevant level. And if there are higher levels of aggregate conceptualization that we care about, NVivo can do that work for us. And so if I were to two-finger click on emotion, towards the bottom here, there's the option to aggregate coding from children. That means count my child codes or my lower level in the hierarchy code as if it were coded up to the emotional level. And so there, now it looks as though I've coded something to emotion, even though the only concept I've used is anger. And similarly, apologize for my light. Similarly, if I choose to code this selection to happiness, now my emotional code has two references, even though one is to anger and one is to happiness. And so that higher level of understanding that parent concept is getting me to is working there. And if I were to just double click on, I'd close one of those to try to lighten the load here. If I double click on emotion, it's going to look across my whole project, across all of the child codes to the emotional code. It's going to pull those things together, and then there are the two examples. If I want to know which emotion it came from, again, I'm going to have to use those coding stripes to turn on and look at which emotions are actually being identified in each example. Right now, I'm just getting that some high emotion was being expressed here, if these references actually match the concept I used at all. Okay. Those are the main things I wanted to say about code organization, nesting, and such. I will look at what the questions are now, and then we'll talk about merging concepts, as well as removing things from concepts or using some nested folder structures before we move on from thinking about code. So let's take a peek at what. what we've got in the codes. All right, so initials are not showing up on mouse over on Mac. That's possible. It is tracking them. Maybe they don't. I didn't realize I didn't have that there. I could talk a bit about changing the concepts. We've talked about the different hierarchy stuff a little bit. Okay, and then yes, if you wanted I see one of the questions was, I've been coding to the child codes. If I wanted to just code something as a high level and not provide what lower level it was, can I? And absolutely you can. And so if I wanted to just code this section as directly as a motion, recent code, nope, it's not my recent code list, we'll have to come here. If I just wanted to code to a motion, I certainly could. And so then a motion would have more concepts in it or more examples in it than its children do, and that's just fine. That works well. While I'm talking about hierarchies of concepts, one note that I want to make, because it is a common, not necessarily a trap, but a common place where people, I think, sometimes go down the wrong path when they're getting started with using a software like NVivo and starting on qualitative analysis in general, is creating one, maybe too many concepts and too many codes where they would be served having either a hierarchy structure or a single code that they then go back and look at and disentangle later, and going way at a very fine-grained detail that they might not need for their research question. So that's one thing to mention. But the other thing is that what this hierarchy can promote people doing is something that looks like this. And so bear with me as I create a couple of codes here. So I'm going to go to create and code. And a structure I sometimes see happen, and I'm just going to use question 1, and we'll create another one that's called question 2. And then under question 1, we're going to have somebody that has like positive. I especially see this here, positive. And then under question 2, they responded to that question positively. And then under question 1, they've also got a negative code. And then under question 2, they've got a negative code. And you can imagine that there are many instances where you're curious about people's responses or the way that they process different pieces of information, and you're trying to just quickly sort them into positivity or negativity, or you're trying to quickly sort them into, they talked about these challenges. And one thing that I saw it come up in a couple of different consults I've had with public health folk, right? They're thinking about standards of care or barriers to care. And transportation or finances or these types of barriers came up in multiple different questions, but they ended up having a transportation code that was, they had 4 different transportation codes under every single question, and then they wanted to understand when did transportation came up, and they had to re-aggregate the 4 different transportation codes. If you think about how I demonstrated you can code multiple things at one time, the better structure for this would be, I'm going to take these 2 codes and we're going to demonstrate how we can move things out of being nested. I'm going to take these 2, I'm going to say, I think on Mac, there's the clever, once you have things selected, there's the move to top level. There is no such button on the PC, so I'm going to have to go cut. I'm going to click so nothing is selected, and then choose paste. And so now negative and positive are at this top level. And I didn't apply any codes here, so me deleting these isn't going to mess anything up. But what one would want to do is, let's say that this section was from question 1 and responded positively or demonstrated whatever idea we had. I would code it as both question 1 and positive. And so that way I can see when people are talking positively, are they talking in question 1 or 2 or whatever? And I can see at the same time every time somebody is talked positively. And you can imagine if we're not just using simple positive, negative, but we're talking about different barriers to care or different challenges people are facing in their lives, you want to see those challenges regardless if they're in response to a single question. But you might also be curious about, did they mention that challenge in this single question? And this structure of having multiple codes and you're saying this is both question 1 and about whatever thing, allows you to do that more nimbly than recreating a similar set of codes many different times across a document. And so that's just a common coding challenge that I see people fall into. The other thing that I want to talk a bit about here is maybe I created a code underneath happiness called joy, right? Some higher level of that. And I'm going to code something to that. So this example actually has some meat to it. So I'm going to code this selection to joy. And we note that happiness does not have aggregation turned on. And so if I wanted joy to be counted as happiness, I would need to turn on code aggregation for that. The other thing I should mention here is you can turn off that counting up at any time you want. You can see it's just a checkbox next to emotion. If I turn that checkbox off, it's not counting up anymore. And so it gives you some fluidity of moving back and forth of how you want to look at your information, which is also nice, and so it doesn't lock you into any decision at any point. But maybe as my project progresses, I realize that joy and happiness are not that different from one another, right? That these two ideas, the way they're showing up in my data, it's indistinguishable and it doesn't gain me anything in my understanding. And so I can merge joy into happiness. And so I would cut joy, and then when I click on happiness, instead of just the paste option, I have the merge into selected code. And it asks if there are anything that have been linked or tied to that. Do I bring that over? I say yes. And that brings that concept together. And so now there's one thing that was joy and one thing that was happiness. They are both now considered as that concept of happiness. What I can do here now, and you can always get back to your definitions and those kind of things. If you right click on it, on Mac, it would say get info, and on Windows, go to the properties. And here we have this, we can change the name. The other thing I do recommend, or I often think of as a good practice, apologies, it is not possible to get a new line in this window for some unknown reason. And so I usually use some vertical bars to indicate that it's a different thought that I'm putting into this description. And I usually say the code joy was merged into this that day because blank, right? And just sort of have a note to myself that I at one point thought that there was another conceptualization going on and I changed my mind. If these concepts were very disparately related or they weren't nested, often before I do a merge, I nest the one concept underneath the other, because then I can use that aggregate feature to consider them both as one idea if I want, to sort of test out, am I thinking about these two things together or not, before I do the more or less unreversible step of merging a code and getting rid of a differ. And so that is a sort of in this, with the joy and happiness example, they were already nested, but that is something that I often do to sort of step towards that practice. The other main thing that one does, other than sort of navigate the codes thing while you're reading, is sometimes it's nice to, if code is your sort of highlighter or sticky note, sometimes it's nice to have a marginal note that something made you think a thing. And NVivo calls those annotations. And so if I select a given piece of text, one of the options in here is to create a new annotation. And this will look a little bit different in Mac and PC, but here I can write a note about this selection that I want to remember. Okay, excellent. And so that is tracked there. It's also tracked in my project under the Notes tab. And here under Notes, we've got places for memos and annotations. And if I click on annotation, I can see that there is an annotation in Barbara. And if I were to double click on it, it would jump me to where I already am. So there's not much point in making it do that. but it's going to keep that list of annotations there. In the Mac version, it's also going to give you a preview of what that annotation says, which is I find very useful as well. Let me take a quick look here. There at what questions we have. So first, is there an undo button? Yes, there is. It's this on the Windows version. It's this tiny little button here up on the top ribbon that might be underneath our names or my faces. I'm not sure how your screen is set up, but it's sort of in the top right-hand corner. I forget where it is on Mac, but the old controller or Apple Z also works just fine at doing undo. And then there were two questions on sort of my recommendations on coding practice as far as nesting things into specific codes. There is one situation where I find it useful to have codes that are specific to a question, and that's if I'm doing a large team-based coding project, and I'm fairly confident that the codes are just relevant to one question. And as I'm doing training to bring people up to speed on how to apply coding, I think it's just going to be easier for them to say, I'm looking at question 1. This is my slate of codes. I have choices to apply. I go and do that. And in the training other coders to do the work, I think that prioritizing the expediency of that process and the ease for other people to do the labor, I think is more important than if I need to do some cleaning later about harmonizing a couple different codes that have maybe been repeated. So that's the one time that I might have repeated nested codes underneath a specific question. In any time I am doing a study by myself or working with a small team that is also fairly proficient, I have a set of questions that are a set of codes that are just the questions, and I have a set of questions that are thematic, and they're not related other than how they show up in the data, right? And so sure, there might be a number of concepts that only show up in certain questions, fine, but I don't organizationally set it up that way. And that might be more my preference than it is, best practice or anything, but that's the way that that I tend to think about organizing that. In fact, frequently the way I set up my sort of structural question codes is I create a new folder over here on the left that is called interview questions or focus group questions, or whatever you might be looking at. And so underneath this code folder, I have a section that is just the list of questions, and then I apply those to the documents, and then my main level of codes are just conceptual. And I find that a little bit more useful, or not useful, a little bit clearer for me organizationally as I'm considering the material. And so you can have codes live in different folders, and again, you can nest folders in the same way that you can nest codes ad infinitum if you so choose. In this coding process, there are a couple different ways that NVivo can help you speed up some more routine rote tasks. And I'm going to show a couple of those here. I'm going to use this Barbara transcript as an example, and it's going to look a little bit different in Windows as it's going to look in Mac. And so if we've got a lot of Mac users, bear with me for one moment. I am going to go up here to the document and auto code. It would also be found on the home ribbon and auto code. And I'm going to use a feature that is not present on Mac, and I'm going to show us the workaround in just a moment. I guess I should say one other word. One thing we should note about this document is that it's got two very good features going for how it is organized to help NVivo break it apart for us quickly. One, it is using paragraph styles, and so usually if you're in a word processor, you're often in the normal style, but you can adjust that. And if I go to edit, you'll see what I mean here. Right, this is the normal style of text, but if I am in this it is a heading. It is heading 1, and I believe the speaker's name are noted as heading 2. And NVivo can understand that if you create it in Google Docs or in a Word document and you download the Word document, whatever you have, NVivo understands those different paragraph styles, at least in the Windows version, and will be able to use those to break the document up into different sections for us. The other thing it does is it has the speaker name and the question numbers completely over to the left and consistently formatted. And both of those things, if you're on Windows or Mac, will help it to break things up for us if we want to do so. And so I'm just going to demonstrate that a couple different ways here as I move the Zoom controls out of the way. All right, so I'm going to hit the auto code button. And in Windows, I can use the style or structure of the document to break it up. And those are those paragraph styles I was just mentioning. And so I'm going to ask it to break things up by paragraph style. And then I can ask what styles do I want. And here I'm going to choose heading 1. And I'm going to say next. And I want this to go into an existing folder because I just made it. I'm going to select the folder as interview questions. If this folder didn't exist, I could say make a folder called interview questions, but I just made it. And then I'm going to say finish. And so it's going to find every time there was heading 1. And then it's going to find the next time there was a heading 1. And it's going to break the document up into those interview questions for me. And so I've got question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4, question 5, etc. And if I were to open one of these up, it's going to show me all the responses from that question on this document. I could apply this to all my interviews if the transcripts were similarly formatted, and it would pull across all of them in that same way. I could do that same task, and here we're going to do that with auto code, and I'm going to choose that second style, heading 2, which I know was my speakers. So I don't want heading 1 anymore. I want heading 2. We'll say next. And I want this to go to a new code or case. And when we're talking about our participants or other things we want organizationally for understanding and comparing our information, that is what NVivo thinks about as a case, not a code usually. And so I'm going to change this from a code to a case. And I'm going to call this interviewees. Participants, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to hit finish. So now under my list of cases, I have this case for interviewees, and nested under them, we have Barbara and Henry. So it took those speakers' name. And so now I have everything that Barbara said as the participant. And if I knew information about Barbara, I could bring that information in as a way to classify Barbara as a classification sheet and provide the attributes to describe Barbara's identities, Barbara's position on some closed-ended survey that she took before she did the interview, whatever you might have. And you can bring that in and use it to sort her responses later. And that will get applied to all her responses throughout the document. Now, for our Mac using friends, and for other forms of document where maybe you don't have paragraph styles, you just have good formatted things, what you can use, and I go back to my Barbara document here, I can use the speaker name, which Mac also has as an option, as a way to do that identification. And here, it just can't do it automatically. I need to tell it what it's looking for. So one of the things it's looking for is Q.1. And it finds that first question. And I know that there's a Q.2. I know that there's a Q.3. And a Q.4. Right? And a Q.5. And we're going to keep on doing this. Q.6. Q.7. Until we get this nice big old red X, which tells me it never found that in the document. That question doesn't exist. I would have known that if I actually made the survey or remembered or what have you. But now I've got those all set up. it thinks it's looking for speakers in, say, a focus group transcript. It's looking for how I labeled my interview questions. It doesn't matter. This will work the same way. I say next. It is going to try to create the big problem is that it's going, or the problem, it's not that big of a problem. I'm going to call this case. It's going to put them under cases instead of under codes, and we can get around that elsewhere if we need to interview, or we can move them later if we want. Interview questions is the type of thing it is. Shove it under the cases, hit finish. And so that's the only limitation here, is it's not putting it in my nice coding folder. It's shoving them under these cases. I could, right here, move that over with a cut and a paste into code if I wanted to go through that process. For interest of time, I'm not going to go through that at the moment, but that, and you could also just leave them here, right? It does the same job of organizing the questions in the way that you wanted to. And similarly, we could do that speaker name for both Henry. Oh, I need to, type his name correctly. Henry and Barbara, and it will similarly break that document up by what Henry and Barbara say. And you can get that little preview there as we go through to see the colors are changing correctly, and I could click through and create those cases as well. And so that is a quick way to break documents up, do some of that structural coding, participant identification, and things of that nature. The other way that it can expedite some of your processes is by using the text search. So under the Explore tab, there are going to be a bunch of forms of analysis, and we're going to talk more about some of those when we switch to the sample project in about 5 minutes, where some of these analyses will be set up for us so we can better understand what they're going to look like. But here we're just going to use the text search to speed our study a little bit. And so the text search should come up for you all, and it's going to look slightly different on Mac, but should not be disconcertingly so. And I'm going to look for, in my entire project, I'm going to look for the word, let's say, environment, because I know that that came up in at least some of those documents. I have the option to stem that so I can get the different endings of words, environment, environmental, all those different types of variations, so I don't need to think about them. And so I almost always, if I'm looking for a very specific word or phrase, I tend to stem that. Its ability in dictionary lookup of synonyms or specializations and generalizations varies drastically on the type of word you're using and how useful they are, so it's worth testing. And those I don't even think are present in the Mac version, which again isn't a big loss because I can't think of many times I've actually had to use them. Typically when I'm thinking about this, there's a phrase or a word that I know I want to catch every time it showed up, and I'm always going to be assigning it the same way. And that usually happens, but it doesn't happen, at least in my types of things that I do, it doesn't happen very frequently, right? So once that is set up, I then go over here and find the Run Query button. And again, I think this view is a little bit more vertical in the Mac version. And so just look for a button that says Run Query. And the first thing it's showing me here is the summary of where it found that word and how many times. So it found it in the Australia document. It found it in the Barbara document 9 times, the Charles document once. And then you can switch between the summary and the reference view, which actually shows where that came up in context. On Mac, those buttons should be right above the list, summary and reference next to each other. On Windows, it's going to be far to the right and possibly hidden by some of your zoom controls, depending on how you have set up your screen. But on the far right edge of your screen, there are tabs to switch between summary and reference on the Windows version. And we'll let that think for a moment, and it's going to now demonstrate in context every time that word environment showed up. Okay, there we go. We have got connection to Down East natural environment, and we can see that the word it found is in slightly darker text and the rest is in slightly lighter text. By default, it is showing us 5 words on either side as context. If we want more, we can request more. We can request more. Where did that button go? I don't see the button at the moment, but we'll talk about it again here in when we go through saving this, because I know where it is there. So we've got this view here. The other thing that you may have an option to see is a word tree. And if you click on that, you're going to get that word in context and the words that immediately precede and follow it. So you can see if there are common descriptors that fall on either side of the word. In this case, just having an article in front of it doesn't tell us a whole lot, but you can imagine situations where there is, a common set of descriptors being used for a given word that might help highlight for you. Once we have this result here, all we're doing is previewing it. We're not saving it in any way. And so if I want this to become a concept that I use in the future, I need to go and find the Save Results button. And that will turn this into something that I can use later in my analysis. When I click on Save Results, it brings up a Store Query Results window where it asks me if I want to create a new code or case, and that is what I want to do. I'm going to call this environment search. I always, when I do this, remind myself that the code that I'm creating here came in an automated fashion, that this wasn't my inferences, it wasn't me making this meaning, it was a text search for environment stemmed on March 21. And I tend to date these things because if I want every time I caught a certain word and I add documents later, I want to remember when I ran this search so I know if there's a document that was dated later than that, I need to rerun the search to make sure it's caught as well. And I don't fool myself into thinking that I've caught every example when I missed the last set of those documents. By default, it's going to drop this in the query results section, which is, I can't scroll because I've got this down, but it's way down in the left-hand side of this organization. If I'm just exploring, great. If I'm using this as a concept that I want to use for later analysis, I want this with all my other codes as if I had coded it myself. So I'm going to hit select, and I'm going to move it to the codes folder so that it lives with my other ideas and concepts that I've identified. And then I can say, okay. We'll wait for it to think. That query results view will turn into a code view, which we should be familiar with. It has that little circle icon, and it's going to be all those examples in their context. We'll let NVivo continue to think here for a moment. All right, here we are. And so now we have this code in its context. And you will note that it is showing us the surrounding words, but the only thing that is in darker text, which means it is actually present in this concept, is the word environment. And I don't love to have one word holding examples of my codes. I want the code to contain or the references to my concept to contain the context of that concept so I can make more sense of it later. And what we need to do then is spread this coding beyond just the word. In the Windows version, you may have noticed that there was in my search setup the ability to select to spread that coding right away. In the Mac version, that doesn't exist, and so they're going to go through this workflow, and that's why I'm demonstrating it here. And so the way to spread this, selection broader is to use, to select all, Control or Command A to get everything selected. And then you'll see this, there's a spread coding button that shows up or if I two-finger click, there should also be the option here to spread coding. Now, a narrow context will take this one word example to the 5 words on either side. So it'll be, 11 words that have been captured. Or the broad context will try to find a natural break in the document, which tends to be a couple sentences or a paragraph, depending on how close like a hard paragraph style break is from the word. And so it kind of fudges that a bit. And so sometimes it's a little bit bigger and sometimes a little bit smaller to try to find that natural break. And so since narrow context is always 5 words either side, I'm not going to demonstrate that. I'm going to demonstrate what that broad context is going to look like here. And so again, it's just going to each of those examples, finding that word, spreading so that more of it is captured by the code, and doing that iteratively for every single example. And so here we see there are full paragraphs now selected. In some of these places where the word showed up in maybe a question or the heading, it's just that little section because there were so many page breaks, it didn't want to grab more. And most likely we can just get rid of that, right? If I don't care about it showing up in the question, I could select this and uncode from this code. And that would remove this from this search result if I wanted to. And you can do that with every code. Sometimes if you have many, many results that work fine here, you will find that when you do that spread coding, you scroll down and 2/3 of the way through, it's just the word again, right? It somehow it got lost or it forgot to do the rest of it, or it didn't save, or I don't know what, but it stops working partway through. All you need to do is select again and select everything again, choose spread coding. If it's already spread the coding on the first thing, it's going to ignore that, and it's just going to find the places where it failed, and it's going to fix it. And so sometimes it does take me, especially if I'm working on a Mac or working with somebody using a Mac, it might take a couple times if you have, 100 some results or something like that. And it'll get there. It'll get there. But that is a way you can do some sort of automated keyword-based coding. All right. Are there any questions on using some of those features to sort of speed the markup process along before we move into looking at the sample project in some of the later stage analyses that one might do? Okay, seeing no questions popping up, I am going to close this project that we've been working on exampling here by going to File and Close. And that should bring me back to that starting screen here in a moment. Sure, save those if you'd like. It did not seem to like that. All right, there it is. All right, are you still seeing my NVivo screen? Let me just see that. That took a second. Yes, it looks like. Okay, great. Thank you for your patience on that turnover. What you should see on this main screen, and again, this main screen looks slightly different on a Mac, but there should be a button that says Sample Project. And that will, it's built in, it takes a second to generate the file, but it's a fully formed research project studying environmental change in a coastal North Carolina community that's apparently referred to as Down East. I don't want to do a tour. Thank you. And so there's a document that if you're interested, it gives a bit of an overview. But you can also look here and see that there are many different folders and many different kinds of files. A couple of those sample files I drew directly from here. So we've got a number of different interview transcripts. We have a couple or an academic article, a couple news articles. We also have what I wanted to show is what a survey response looks like once it comes fully into NVivo. And so if I open the survey response, they ran an online survey, and we end up with, a pretty similar spreadsheet view of what that survey looks like. And the two notable features are as follows. One, you have columns that are sort of grayed out, and that means that those are filtering or sorting closed-ended responses that you can use on later forms of analysis to say, I want to see everybody who, lived in a certain town and what their responses were. So you can do things like that, or just click that filter button there. And then you've got the white columns, which work like any other document in NVivo. And so I can select text, I can two-finger click and code that text and identify what concepts I want to say are in those open-ended replies. I can use the text search feature to find keywords and those types of things based in those responses. If I want, and so that's sort of how that will come in. We also have a fully fledged code book here with tons of codes showing up hundreds of times. And so it's a good place to sort of play around, open those things up, see how fast or not fast it does on your particular machine at bringing those different documents together and getting a sense of how you can, work with your information aggregated into these overarching concepts. It also does a really good job having some cases and information for all of their participants. And so here we have a case of all of the interview. You have cases for each interview participant. And we can see what that classification structure, and the classification structure, again, is just sort of the overarching way of thinking about applying different pieces of information to those cases. We classify them. We say these are all people, and people have different characteristics or attributes, like their identities or their, where they came from or what have you. And so that gets captured in this classification sheet. And so you can create this in Excel, you can create this in NVivo, and so specify for each individual, you want them to be associated with a certain place, some answers that they've had, their income levels, whatever types of information you want to collect can be managed directly in the software with this classification structure and then used for your analysis. And that's what I'm going to show in what is saved in this project towards the bottom. So here under Explore and Queries, we have a number of query criteria that have been saved. And these are all set up different searches and sort of next stage analyses. Frequently, in qualitative work, what you need is that list of concepts and the examples, and then you start to build your explanation or your understanding of what your participants' lived experience were, and you write about that, and you give your key quotes in your examples, and you talk about the balance of the different concepts, and that might be enough, right? That might be the end of it. Sometimes you might want to compare different concepts to one another or see the patterns of what types of participants had what types of concepts showing up, and that's where these extra queries start to come into play. And one of the things that you might want to do is look at how certain economic issues show up in certain ages or genders. And you use that cross-tabulation query, which is under Explore and Queries, which would create this sort of setup, and it's sort of preset this all so you can see what that result is going to look like. And so what we have here is a list of codes that we're interested in on the left, or at the top if you're on the sort of the vertical view that the Mac version shows. And then on the right, we're setting which items do we want to look at. We want to look at all the people in our study, and we want to break them down by what attributes, their age, and their gender identity. And so here we have that table broken out. These are all of the different sort of economic questions or different economic concepts that came up in the interviews. And we have, whether things came up more for men or women in different age groups. Each of these numbers, and it is thinking a little bit longer than I anticipated, but each of these numbers is live to the data. And so if I wanted to see the 40-something male identifying people, the 12 of them that specifically talked about phishing and what they said about that, all I would need to do is double click on that 12. Is it going to let me do that now? Oh, it's thinking so hard. it will open up and find across my entire project, across the survey survey responses, across the interview. It will find those 12 examples and display them in concert. And I'm sorry that it is seeming to have hung a bit here. Not loving the Zoom and NVivo at the same time, apparently. But that's one way to do that. The other thing we have here is the at the top, and I'll just keep on talking while my screen is a little bit locked about what functions we have. We can count these things different ways. Oh, we're almost there. Right now, it's counting the number of coding references, the number of times this showed up. We can also count the number of people, the number of cases where it appeared by clicking that cases coded button to change that count. We could also just look for presence and absence. Did this concept show up for this type of participant? Yes or no? There is hidden on this right-hand side the ability to turn it into a chart if you want to see a bar graph of these different numbers and have that as an exportable quantity as well. This is not, all right, so I was going to demonstrate, if this had been playing nice, one other type of query that's a little bit difficult to always parse, but it is what's called a coding query. It's the one that's directly above in the list, the comments on water quality, where essentially you can ask sort of logic statement based questions of your data. You can say things like, I want to see if there are any people who identify as male, who have talked about the economy, also mention this idea. And so you sort of build out that query, and it goes and searches and tries to find if there are matches to that. And that is, again, called a coding query. And we would set up sort of a series of statements to match that. I might need to close my NVivo here since it is not deciding to cooperate. So I can talk briefly about collaboration and about getting material out and exporting and sharing things from NVivo. And then we'll have a minute for questions while that is processing. So let me stop screen sharing for a moment while I attempt to recover my machine here. Are there any questions that I can answer? Oh, yes. So the crosstab option is not directly visible under Explore. It is under Explore and then Queries. There are a couple examples of queries, and then there's sort of a catch-all for the ones that didn't fit on the tab. And if you go to that queries, one of the options is crosstab. The more general form, which is right next to that button, is called a matrix coding query, which allows you to more freely define everything. If you want to compare certain concepts to each other and cross codes by codes, instead of what we just did was case classifications, case attributes by codes in that table, you can, with the matrix query, cross codes by codes, for instance, or do the same exact thing as a crosstab. It just takes a lot more click steps. And so the crosstab's a bit quicker way if you are using the cases in their place. All right, let me end that NVivo task and restart NVivo here. All right, so other questions I'm seeing. I'm planning on using different devices, a personal computer and the library to work in NVivo. Can that be done? And so that sort of gets right at the heart of the collaboration question that I want to speak to here. NVivo is a desktop tool. It does not save material to the cloud unless you have money to pay the NVivo software company. I think it's about $500 for a year for a team of up to 5 to have what they call their collaboration cloud, which provides, I think, I'm not positive if it's HIPAA compliant or not, security for cloud storage and then easy merging of multiple people's projects. In general, I don't work with people that have the money to give the company $500 a year to facilitate that. And so they tend to use the university's box storage as their cloud storage, and then be either download from box, work on the project and re-upload when they're done, or use the plugin for Box Drive to have it sync between their machines. NVivo gets a little bit touchy if you're using something other than the ones that I've found that work well are the Google Drive syncing system and the Box syncing system. Both seem to work very well depending on the security of your data, and they're provided by the university. What I know breaks things is Dropbox if you're using personal Dropbox, just because of the way it does its syncing. The iCloud also has had some issues sometimes, and so pausing your syncing if you're trying to save in a cloud synchronized space is best practice while working in NVivo. All right, my software is back. I'm going to share that screen again. In general, because it is a local, not cloud-based service, the way that one collaborates is by creating a starter project that maybe contains all of the files that you are going to use, maybe contains a starting codebook that you're going to use if you're working on a team, and then you distribute that file to your team members. They work individually on what they need to get done, and then periodically send that file via cloud storage, email, whatever your data security requirements require, send that file back to a point person who merges them all together. And you use that import, just like we were importing files, there's this button to import a project, and you can import wholesale somebody else's project. NVivo takes care of merging that. It notes who created what and when. And so then you can do things like check iterator reliability or just harmonize what has been done in those different projects. The one caveat is that, as you've seen, maybe the Mac and the Windows versions look slightly different. They also save slightly different. And so the Windows version can bring in Mac projects, but the Mac version cannot bring in Windows projects. And so under share, one would need to copy a project to the Mac version from Windows to send something to a cross-team collaborator. It's been very common for me to take on a project management role every now and again on people's, on large-scale projects to help with that merging process if need be, because I am here and not everybody has the money for the $500 annual extortion that NVivo wants from their for that cloud syncing service. But that is how that tends to work. The other thing that you can do with this with the export project button is create this REFI QDA project, which is the open source version of qualitative projects that works cross-platform, cross-softwares, works with that open source tool I mentioned earlier. And so if archivally you want something that isn't tied to a license, you would export and make that specific thing. The other thing I want to note is that everything that you're looking at any time, you can go to share and export and get it out into a PDF, into an Excel spreadsheet, into a Word document, into something that you can, again, use outside of NVivo. And so those tables that we were creating with the queries, you can export those to Excel. With your list of every example of when infrastructure came out, you can export that to Word. You could select all your codes, just, come on, collaborate with me. There we go. Select all your codes, go to export, and it would create a Word document for every single code with all of the quotations from them. There are many different ways to start getting things here out of the software if you wanted to. As far as references for how else you might work with this, NVivo has a number of their own sort of short videos on YouTube through their company. It was called QSR, so that channel might still exist. It's now called Lumivero, Lumivero. And so those company channels have how-to videos for like how to run a specific query, for instance. If that's the kind of question you have, There's plenty of that kind of information there. If the questions are more on how do I use this tool and the various buttons there are to answer my specific research questions, that is what grant funding overhead pays me to exist for. And so please feel free to reach out via email and set up a time to consult about specific sort of methodological analysis style questions and how you can best utilize the tool to address those types of questions. But if it's sort of how to on the specific things, the YouTube videos on, you know, very specific features do a pretty decent job now that you've got sort of a high level overview of what you can accomplish and what types of things exist in the tool. There are other questions I can ask. I know we are at time and I want to respect that. And so if there are other questions we can have, yes, please email me if you have questions. My email is on the slides. It's also now in the chat. Do feel free to be in touch. So I am a resource. Yes, I'm a resource funded by the College of Liberal Arts, but I am largely available for social and behavioral science across. I have consulted with a number of teams in maternal child health and elsewhere in public health over the past number of years, and would be happy to continue that relationship. The continued learning question I see in the chat. So the other than the specific task oriented YouTube videos that there are existing, I have in the past run an advanced workshop that focuses a lot on the case features and sort of getting classification data in and how to use cases and attributes. And so there's a recording of that available. It's called Advanced NVivo. I'm putting a link in the chat that has tons of workshop recordings, but if you find the Advanced NVivo recording in this, you would find that recording as well. There are, and we used to have as a university, a license to what was called, oh my goodness, it had some cutesy name and then it became LinkedIn Learning, but it had a bunch of like online course videos and things like that. We no longer have that, but that had a number of sort of structural, like 2-3 hour long NVivo workshops that were broadly available. I don't know of another resource like that that is free and available. Every once in a while, the NVivo company runs sort of task-oriented online free webinars, and I would recommend those. They do have fee-based training sessions, and I'm not entirely positive on the value for money on those for university folk, but I have also done many individualized trainings for different lab groups and for specific research projects and research questions, and I'm a resource for you to do that type of work if that would be useful. Are there any other questions I can ask before I say goodbye to the few of you that are still here? I'm going to stop sharing. I don't think we're going to be poking around at that tool anymore, actually. Okay, well, thank you all very much for your attention and time, and I hope this was a useful use of your lunch hour.